I thought my boss was offering me a career move. I didn't realize she was asking for permission to love me. By the time I understood, I had already said no. I didn't quit right away. I quit months later, lying awake at night, when I finally understood what I'd said no to. My name is Sophie, and I've always been good at choosing things that felt safe, things that fit neatly into boxes, things that didn't ask too much of me emotionally. At the time, I thought I was choosing stability. That's the word I used whenever anyone asked me why I never chased promotions or department jumps the way everyone else seemed to. Stability sounded mature, responsible. It sounded like something people nodded at approvingly instead of questioning. What I really meant was that I was afraid of breaking something that already worked. Our department wasn't perfect, but it was steady, in the way you stop noticing once it becomes part of your daily rhythm. The team trusted each other enough to argue honestly. We stayed late together without resentment. We celebrated small wins with cheap takeout and tired laughter that echoed down hallways long after most of the building went dark. I had carved out a place there that felt safe, predictable, mine. And above all of it, there was her. Lisbeth, my boss. She was the kind of woman people respected before they even spoke to her. She carried herself with a calm precision that made the entire floor feel quieter when she walked through it. She never raised her voice. She never rushed. She spoke like every sentence had already been edited 3 times in her head before she allowed it into the room. Her office sat along the outer wall of the building, framed entirely in glass. From inside, you could see the city stretching endlessly past the skyline. From outside, you could see her working long after everyone else had gone home. There were no personal photos in her office, no awards on display, no plants or decorations trying to soften the space. Just clean surfaces, muted colors, and a desk that always looked exactly the same, no matter how late it was. I told myself she was intimidating. That was the simplest explanation, but intimidation doesn't usually come with small, almost invisible kindnesses. She was the one who noticed when I stayed late too often and quietly shifted deadlines without announcing it. She corrected people who spoke over me in meetings without making it obvious she was doing it. When she praised my work, she did it privately, like she understood that public attention made me uncomfortable. She never crossed lines, not even close. If anything, she seemed careful about distance in a way that sometimes felt deliberate. I didn't question it. I told myself she was simply professional. Looking back, I think she was trying very hard not to be anything else. The first time she asked me to stay after a meeting, I assumed I'd made a mistake. I replayed the presentation in my head while everyone packed their laptops and filtered out of the conference room. By the time the door closed behind the last person, I'd convinced myself I'd overlooked something critical. She didn't sit across from me like she usually did during evaluations. Instead, she leaned lightly against the edge of the table, arms folded loosely, like she wasn't sure how formal she wanted to be. "You've been handling the integration projects exceptionally well," she said. Relief loosened my shoulders before I could stop it. "Thank you," I said carefully, waiting for the inevitable, but that usually followed praise in corporate conversations. It never came. Instead, she asked questions, not about deadlines or metrics, about how I liked the workload, whether I felt challenged enough, whether I saw myself growing in that role long term. I answered honestly. I liked what I did. I liked my team. I liked knowing how everything fit together. She nodded slowly, like she was filing each answer somewhere important. At the time, I thought she was being thorough, supportive, the kind of manager people hope to work under but rarely did. I didn't realize she was measuring something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, she found small reasons to include me in meetings that technically didn't require my presence. Cross-department planning sessions, strategy reviews, budget discussions that floated just above my pay grade. Each time, she framed it as exposure, development, experience. Each time, she watched me more than she watched the presentations. I noticed that part, but I misread it. I thought she was evaluating whether I could handle more responsibility. I worked harder because of it. Stayed later. Prepared obsessively. Tried to prove she hadn't overestimated me. If there were moments when her attention felt heavier than professional observation, I brushed them aside. I told myself I was imagining things, that she was simply invested in her team's success. The afternoon she asked me into her office about the transfer started like any other workday. The floor hummed with quiet productivity. Someone down the hall was arguing politely over spreadsheet formatting. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from the break room, familiar and mildly tragic. When her assistant told me she wanted to see me, I grabbed my notebook automatically. I didn't even consider that the conversation might not involve project updates. Her office felt colder than usual when I stepped inside. The late afternoon sun filtered through the glass walls, casting long shadows across her desk. She stood near the window instead of behind her chair, hands clasped loosely in front of her, posture unusually tense. She closed the door gently behind me. "I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something careful underneath it, like she was stepping across fragile ground. "There's an opening in another department," she continued. "One that would suit you." I remember smiling immediately, reflexively, the polite smile you give when someone suggests something you already know you're going to decline. "I'm not really looking to move," I said, keeping my tone warm. "But I appreciate you thinking of me." She nodded too quickly, as if she'd expected resistance, but hoped she was wrong. "It would be a lateral move," she said. "Same level, different responsibilities, you'd have more flexibility." The word landed strangely between us. Flexibility wasn't something our company emphasized. It wasn't something she ever emphasized. "I'm really happy where I am," I said, shifting my weight slightly, trying to sound grateful rather than dismissive. "And I like working under you." The second the phrase left my mouth, something flickered across her expression. It was brief, almost invisible, but it tightened the air in the room. She turned slightly, glancing toward the window, before looking back at me. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more deliberate. "You wouldn't be under me anymore," she said. I laughed lightly, assuming she meant organizational structure. "I don't mind that," I replied. "You're a great manager." Silence stretched between us, heavier this time. She studied me like she was searching for something she couldn't quite reach. "It might create healthier boundaries," she said carefully. "Professionally." That word again, carefully chosen, weighted in a way I didn't understand. "I think our boundaries are fine," I said. Still smiling, still completely certain I was reassuring her. Her shoulders lowered slightly. For a fraction of a second, I thought she looked relieved. The expression disappeared so quickly, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. "Of course," she said, returning to her composed, measured tone. "I just wanted you to know the option was available." I thanked her again. Told her I appreciated her looking out for my career. Told her I hoped she didn't think I was ungrateful. She assured me she didn't. When I stood to leave, she moved as if she were going to say something else. Her hand lifted slightly off the desk, fingers curling inward before settling back down. "Your team is lucky to have you," she said instead. I walked out of her office, feeling proud of myself. Loyal, grounded, like I'd made the mature decision. The door clicked shut behind me with a soft, final sound I didn't think twice about. For the rest of the afternoon, I returned to my desk, answered emails, joked with my coworkers about a broken printer, and accepted an invitation to after-work drinks I didn't particularly want to attend, but joined anyway out of habit. Life continued exactly the way it always had. I didn't notice that she stayed in her office long after the sun disappeared behind the skyline. I didn't know she had spent nearly 2 months coordinating with HR to ensure the transfer would eliminate any direct reporting conflict. And I definitely didn't know that she had planned to ask me something else once the paperwork was finalized. Something she couldn't risk asking while I still technically worked under her. That realization didn't come until much later. At first, the only change was silence. She stopped stopping by my desk, stopped forwarding articles she thought I'd find interesting, stopped lingering after meetings when everyone else filed out. Her emails became shorter, cleaner, entirely procedural. I told myself this was what professionalism looked like when it was done properly. I told myself she was respecting my decision. I told myself I should feel relieved. But sometimes, during meetings, I would catch her looking at me across the conference table with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not disappointment, not frustration, something quieter. Something that made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. And every time our eyes met, she looked away first. I thought it meant I'd made things awkward by overthinking her suggestion. I thought she was giving me space. I thought the strange, hollow feeling growing in my chest was just guilt for turning down an opportunity she believed I deserved. I didn't realize I hadn't turned down a career move. I had turned down the only safe way she knew how to step closer to me. I wouldn't understand that until weeks later, when I overheard a conversation that was never meant for me. The first thing I noticed wasn't what she stopped doing, it was how quiet everything became once she did. At first, I told myself nothing had changed, that I was imagining the distance because I'd rejected an opportunity she'd taken time to put together. People needed space after those kinds of conversations. I understood that. I respected it. That was the story I repeated to myself while the days stacked neatly on top of one another. But silence has a sound when you're paying attention. It sounded like meetings that ended exactly on time, like emails that arrived without greetings, like my name spoken only when it was strictly necessary. She didn't avoid me. That would have been obvious, easier to name. Instead, she perfected the art of being present without being available. When she passed my desk, she nodded politely, the way she nodded at everyone else. When our eyes met across a room, she didn't hold my gaze the way she used to. She moved on, efficient and unbothered. Professional. I tried to tell myself I preferred it this way, that whatever ease we'd shared before had been accidental, not intentional. That I hadn't lost anything because there'd never been anything to lose. Still, I found myself noticing the absence more than I ever noticed the presence. Before, she used to ask how my weekends went. Not in the obligatory way managers sometimes do, but with follow-up questions that made it clear she'd actually listened to the answer. Now, Mondays passed without comment. Before, she'd linger after meetings under the pretense of clarifying next steps, even when everything was already clear. Now she gathered her things the moment the last slide ended. Before, she corrected people gently when they dismissed my ideas. Now, she let the room handle itself. I told myself it meant she trusted me, that I didn't need defending anymore. But trust didn't feel like this. A week after the transfer conversation, she reassigned one of my projects, not entirely, just a piece of it, a portion that required cross-department collaboration. The reassignment made sense on paper. It streamlined reporting, reduced overlap. It also meant I wouldn't need to meet with her as often. When she explained the change during our one-on-one, she spoke quickly, like she wanted to get through it without leaving space for questions. "Let me know if you have concerns," she said. I didn't, or rather, I didn't know how to articulate the strange sense of being slowly edged out of my own work. "It's fine," I said, "if it makes things easier." She nodded, relief flickering briefly across her face before disappearing again. Easier. That word followed me back to my desk and sat there with me all afternoon. I started noticing patterns I hadn't before. How she positioned herself in meetings so she never ended up seated directly beside me. How she waited until I left common spaces before entering them herself. How when laughter broke out around the table she smiled but never quite joined in. Once, during a late afternoon meeting that ran longer than expected, the rest of the team filtered out slowly, stopping to chat in the hallway. I stayed behind to gather my notes. She was still there, standing near the window, watching the city fade into evening. For a moment, it was just the two of us. The air felt thick with something unsaid. I opened my mouth, unsure what I was even going to say. Some neutral comment about the meeting, probably, when she turned toward me. "I'll send a summary," she said. That was it. She left before I could respond, heels clicking softly against the floor, the door closing with the same careful finality as before. That night, I stayed later than usual, pretending to work while my thoughts drifted in uncomfortable directions. Had I offended her? Had I embarrassed her? Had she interpreted my refusal as rejection in a way I hadn't intended? I replayed the conversation in her office over and over, searching for the moment I might have misstepped. Each time, I arrived at the same conclusion. I'd been polite, grateful, Clear. There was no reason for things to feel this strained. A few days later, I ran into her in the break room. It was early, too early for most people, and the space was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. She stood at the counter, staring into her coffee like it held answers. She looked tired. I hadn't noticed how tired she looked before. "Morning," I said. She glanced up, startled, then smiled quickly. "Good morning." We stood there, inches apart, surrounded by the mundane smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. For a moment, it felt like the old version of us might reappear. The easy one, the comfortable one. Instead, she stepped back. "I should get to my next meeting," she said, though neither of us checked the time. "Of course," I replied. She hesitated, like she wanted to say something else. Her gaze dropped briefly to the floor before lifting again, steady and unreadable. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For understanding," she answered. Then she left, leaving me alone with a coffee I hadn't even poured yet. Understanding what? The question followed me for days. The first real crack in my certainty came a week later, by accident. I was walking past the HR offices on my way to a different floor when I heard my name. I didn't stop immediately. Hearing your name in a workplace doesn't always mean it's about you. But something in the tone, lowered, cautious, made me slow my steps. "She turned it down," someone said. "Really?" Another voice replied. "After all that work?" "It happens, but you know how rare it is for her." "For who?" "For her," the first voice said, unmistakably referring to my boss. "She doesn't push transfers unless it's personal." There was a pause. Papers shuffled. I thought it was obvious. So did I. My heart started beating in a way that felt disproportionate to the conversation. Loud, insistent, personal. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't trust myself to linger without being noticed. I walked away slowly, forcing my expression to remain neutral while my thoughts raced ahead without me. Personal how? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying everything again. Every careful word, every emphasis on ethics and boundaries, every strange pause that had felt insignificant at the time. You wouldn't be under me anymore. It might create healthier boundaries. Flexibility, space, distance. The words rearranged themselves into something new, something I wasn't ready to name yet. I told myself I was overthinking. That workplace rumors grew easily in the absence of information. That HR speculation didn't mean anything. Still, the hollow feeling in my chest shifted. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was the first quiet spark of fear that I might have misunderstood everything. And if I had, I didn't know how to fix it. Once the thought formed, it refused to leave. I carried it with me through meetings, through emails, through conversations that required my attention while my mind stayed somewhere else entirely. It hovered just out of reach, too unsettling to look at directly, but impossible to ignore. Personal? That was the word that changed everything. I told myself it could mean anything. That HR loved exaggeration. That people always assumed there was a story when someone senior went out of their way for a subordinate. It didn't have to mean that. Except, nothing else fit. If it were purely strategic, she would have pushed harder. If it were about performance, she would have documented it. If it were about development, she would have offered alternatives. Instead, she had offered distance, space, a way out from under her. She studied me, searching my face like she was trying to confirm something. "You chose what mattered to you," she said. "That's never wrong." I wanted to tell her she mattered too, that I hadn't known how to choose something I hadn't recognized as an option. But the moment passed. She smiled once, soft, restrained, and walked away. I stood there long after she was gone, finally understanding the full shape of what I'd missed. And realizing, with a cold certainty, that if I didn't say something soon, I might never get the chance. After that conversation in the lobby, I stopped pretending I could think about anything else. Work became a series of motions I completed on autopilot. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I nodded at the right moments. But every spare second, my mind circled back to the same question. How do you confess to someone who never actually confessed to you? The knowledge I carried felt dangerous now. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was fragile. One wrong assumption, one poorly chosen sentence, and I could shatter something she'd worked very hard to protect. So I did what I'd always done when faced with uncertainty. I hesitated. I told myself she deserved peace, that she'd made her choice to step back, to put distance between us for a reason. That dragging my feelings into the open now would be selfish. But restraint started to feel less like respect and more like fear. A few days later, I learned the transfer request had been formally withdrawn. The information came to me accidentally, the way so many important things do, through a passing comment, a line in a meeting agenda that didn't quite make sense. I followed up with HR under the guise of curiosity, keeping my tone light, professional. "Oh," the coordinator said, scanning her screen. "Yes, that request was closed." "Closed?" I asked, as in, filled? "No," she said, "withdrawn." I thanked her and hung up before my voice could give me away. Withdrawn. Not denied. Not delayed. Withdrawn. That meant she'd pulled it herself. The weight of that decision pressed down on me harder than anything else had so far. She hadn't just accepted my refusal, she'd erased the option entirely, chosen to remove the temptation rather than risk crossing a line, chosen distance over hope. That night, I opened my laptop again. This time I didn't try to write a confession. I tried to write a question. "Can we talk?" Delete. "I've been thinking about the transfer conversation." Delete. "I think I misunderstood something, and I don't want to carry that misunderstanding anymore." Delete. Every version felt inadequate, too vague, too invasive, too late. I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen, watching my own reflection look back at me, uncertain, tired, braver than I felt. The next day was her last on our floor. She didn't announce it widely. No farewell email, no gathering. Just quiet transitions and careful goodbyes behind closed doors. I found out by accident again when I saw the boxes. They sat neatly stacked outside her office, labeled in her precise handwriting. Files, books, personal items I'd never seen displayed. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to decide whether to knock. My heart pounded in a way that felt ridiculous for someone who hadn't technically lost anything. When the door opened, I nearly jumped. She looked surprised to see me, then quickly masked it. "I was just about to come find you," she said. "You were?" My voice came out softer than I intended. "Yes." She gestured toward her office. "Do you have a moment?" I stepped inside, acutely aware that this might be the last time I ever would. The office looked the same as always, clean, controlled, but something was different now. The desk was bare. The shelves were empty. Temporary spaces always feel more honest to me, like there's less to hide. "I wanted to thank you," she said once the door was closed. "For what?" "For how you handled everything," she replied. "The transfer, the changes afterward. You were gracious." Gracious. The word hurt more than it should have. "I didn't realize there was anything to handle," I said carefully. She studied me, her expression unreadable. "You always do," she said quietly. "You make difficult things look easy." I swallowed. "That's not always intentional." Something in her gaze softened, just slightly. "I know," she said. Silence filled the space between us, dense and waiting. I wanted to say it then, to tell her everything. But fear held me still. The fear of being wrong, of reopening a door she'd already closed with deliberate care. Instead, I said the safest thing I could think of. "I hope the new role gives you what you're looking for." She smiled faintly. "I hope so too." She reached into a drawer I hadn't noticed before and pulled out a thin folder. She hesitated, then placed it on the desk between us. "You should have this," she said. "What is it?" "Documentation," she replied. "From when we discussed the transfer. You're entitled to it." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were notes, emails, drafts, her words, written and rewritten, careful and precise. And then I saw it, an email addressed to me, unsent. The subject line was simple, before anything else. My breath caught. She noticed. Of course she did. "I never sent it," she said quietly. "For obvious reasons." I looked up at her, my heart hammering. "What were the reasons?" I asked. She held my gaze, something unguarded flickering there for the first time. "Because I didn't want to put you in a position you didn't choose," she said. "And because when you declined the transfer, I assumed you were answering more than just a career question." The room felt suddenly too small. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I know," she replied. The words sat between us, heavy and unresolved. "I need to go," she said gently after a moment. "But I wanted you to have the full picture." She gathered her coat and turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she paused. "For what it's worth," she added without looking back, "I never regretted trying to do the right thing." The door closed softly behind her. I stood alone in her empty office, the unsent email trembling in my hands, finally understanding how close I'd come to losing something I hadn't even known I was allowed to want. And realizing that if I didn't act now, there would be no ethical rule left to hide behind. I didn't call her that night. I wanted to. The urge sat in my chest like a live wire, humming with everything I hadn't said in that empty office. But I knew myself well enough to recognize when silence was still doing work, when it was giving me time to choose my words instead of letting them choose me. I went home and read the unsent email again. It was careful. Of course it was. She had written it the way she did everything else, measured, ethical, restrained to the point of ache. She didn't say anything explicitly romantic. There were no confessions, no declarations that would have crossed a line. Instead, she wrote about timing, about responsibility, about wanting to know me without authority complicating the answer. Before anything else, she had written, "I want you to have a choice." I slept with the email open on my phone, like it might disappear if I closed it. The next morning, I drafted a message of my own, not an apology, not a confession, just the truth. "I think I misunderstood the question you were asking me. If you're willing, I'd like to talk, outside of work, without titles." I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. She replied 20 minutes later. Yes, nothing else, just that single word. We met at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. Neutral ground, no polished glass walls, no closed doors, just soft light and the low murmur of other people living their lives around us. She arrived first. I recognized the moment she saw me, not because she smiled, but because she exhaled. Like she'd been holding something in since she walked in. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for saying yes," I replied. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around mugs we hadn't touched. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I didn't want to assume anything. I said finally, "Not then, not now." She nodded. "That's why I never asked directly." "I know. I didn't think you'd want to leave your team," she continued. "And when you declined, I assumed you were choosing what felt safest." "I was," I said. "I just didn't know what I was being asked to leave." Her gaze dropped briefly to the table, then lifted again. "I never wanted you to feel pressured," she said, "or cornered, or like your career was tied to something personal." "It wasn't," I said quickly. "It just wasn't clear to me." She studied me for a moment, then smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "That's fair," she said. "I wasn't clear because I was afraid." So was I. The admission felt like setting something down I'd been carrying for too long. "I thought you didn't want me," I said quietly. "Not beyond work." Her expression softened, something like relief passing through her. "I thought you didn't want anything that complicated," she said. "And I didn't want to be the person who made it complicated for you." We sat with that truth between us, letting it breathe. "I didn't step back because I stopped caring," she said after a moment. "I stepped back because caring didn't feel like something I was allowed to act on." "I know," I said, "but I wish you'd let me decide that." She nodded slowly. "So do I." Outside the cafe window, people passed by, unaware of the careful unraveling happening at our table. "What happens now?" I asked. She considered the question seriously. "Now," she said, "there are no reporting lines, no ethical constraints, just two people who misunderstood each other." "And fear," I added. "And fear," she agreed. "But fear isn't a reason to stay silent anymore." I took a breath, steadying myself. "I don't want to rush anything," I said, "but I don't want to keep pretending I didn't feel something either." Her gaze held mine, warm and unguarded. "Neither do I." There was no dramatic moment, no sudden touch, just a quiet understanding settling into place. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. "Would you like to do this again?" she asked. "Not as a conversation, just coffee." I smiled. "I'd like that," I said. As we walked out into the afternoon light, side by side but not touching, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I wasn't replaying the past. I was imagining a future, slow, uncertain, and finally honest.